Chapter 6 of An English Girl's First Impressions of Burma. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carol Fullerton Samsell at clonesoflangston.com. An English Girl's First Impressions of Burma by Beth Ellis. Chapter 6. The European Inhabitants. Quote from the HMS Pinafore. In spite of all temptations to belong to other nations, he remains an Englishman. The European population of Remyo is small, consisting in fact of but 4 resident ladies and some dozen resident males. But despite their limited number, they form a very friendly and independent little community. Among them are to be found the usual types of Anglo-Indian society, but they display characteristics not met with among the dwellers in larger stations. Remyo is so entirely cut off from civilization that the inhabitants must of necessity depend solely upon themselves for amusement, and as entertainments, at which one would invariably meet the same half-dozen guests, are apt to become a trifle monotonous. The ladies, deprived of this usual mode of killing time, are compelled to devote themselves to domestic pursuits rather more than is the custom of most Anglo-Indians. The comparative coolness of the climate, Remyo being 3,500 feet above sea level, is conducive to such occupations, and whereas in Rangoon or Mandalay housekeeping duties are reduced to a minimum, in Remyo the ladies, having nothing else to do, engage themselves thus with a zeal and energy worthy of a Dutch housewife. But poor souls, they are terribly handicapped. In the first place, they are mostly unaccustomed to housekeeping themselves. Secondly, the servants and household are quite unaccustomed to being kept. And thirdly, it is practically impossible for a mistress to do her own marketing unless she possess an unusual knowledge of the language. She may resolutely keep accounts, lock up stores, walk about all morning in an apron with a large bunch of keys, and have long confidential conversations with the cook. But in spite of all these possibilities, she can only play at housekeeping. The cook and head boy are the real managers of the establishment, and they regard the well-meant efforts of their mistress with the kindly amusement one would extend to a child-keeping house. A Remyo lady's morning interview with her cook, usually a Madrasi, is an amusing interlude. Neither fish nor joints can be procured in the native bazaar, so the poor housekeeper is often at her wits' end to introduce variety into her evening menu. She begins cheerfully, "Well, cook, what have we for dinner tonight?" Cook replies laconically, "Chicken." "Chicken," repeats the mistress doubtfully. "Yes, perhaps that will do. Did you kill it yesterday?" "No, missus, not killed yet." "Oh, cook," in a tone of stern reproach, "missus told you always to kill it the day before. Why have you not done so?" Cook shelters himself behind an unintelligible answer in a mixture of Hindustani and pidgin English, and after an unsuccessful attempt to understand him, his mistress is forced to pass from the subject with a rebuke, which he receives with a reproachful look. "Now," she continues, "what have you for soup?" "Chicken," is again the prompt reply. "Is there really nothing else?" demands the mistress uneasily. "No, there is nothing else." "Well, hopefully you must make a very nice little side dish entree. What can we have?" "Nice bit of grilled chicken," suggests the cook cheerfully. "Oh no, cook," she cries in despair, "we can't have more chicken." "What would missus like then?" Missus has not the vaguest idea of any possible suggestion, so diffidently agrees that perhaps chicken will be nice. She asks about the savoury, but seeing the word chicken again hovering on the cook's lips, decides to make the savoury herself, and turns to receive the daily accounts. Then cook rattles off a long account of his expenditure, which his mistress duly enters into her book, fondly hoping that he isn't charging her more than double the cost of each article, but having no means of discovering the truth. Once or twice, on visits to the bazaar, we asked the price of various things, and triumphantly confronted the cook with the result of our researches. But he was never in the least disconcerted, and at once entered into a long, unintelligible, and quite irrefutable explanation as to why the article was cheaper on that particular day than on any other. It is quite impossible to upset the cheerful sang-froid of a Madrasi. Native servants have the reputation of being most faithful to their master, and perhaps they deserve the character, for they allow no one else to cheat him unless they get the lion's share of the spoil, but they consider it their special prerogative to cheat him themselves at every opportunity. A scolding from a mistress makes little impression on a Madrasi servant. He receives it with an air of gentle reproach, while he most persistently denies the offence, whatever it may be, from a bad dinner to a broken plate or an undeliverable message. It is only the master who, by a wealth of strong language and judiciously directed remarks concerning the origin, parents, and relations of the guilty one, can hope to make the slightest impression upon the impervious native mind. A further difficulty for the young and ardent housekeeper is the number of servants in her establishment. One man is engaged to sweep the floor, another to dust the furniture, one to fetch the water, a second to pour it in the bath, one to lay the knives and forks, and a companion to hand the plates, and so on through every department of the household work. This divided duty is exceedingly convenient to the servants, for if anything be wrong, the fault can always be laid on the absent one, or a scolding delivered to one can be passed on almost unlimitedly until everyone has enjoyed an opportunity of relieving his feelings. But it is inconvenient for a mistress. Such a delay is caused in carrying out an order. For example, if a jug of water be spilled, a first servant picks up the jug, a second dries the table, a third dries the table, a fourth mops up the water from the floor, a fifth rearranges the furniture, a sixth carries out the empty jug, and a seventh fetches the water to refill it. All orders are delivered to the head boy, a most important and dignified personage, and he transmits them through the various ranks of his underlings until they can reach the servant whose duty it is to carry them out. During the transmission through so many channels, of course, the orders become hopelessly mixed. We had only 14 servants, as our house was not large. A few of them, such as the cook, sais, and butler, had definite duties. The remainder seemed to be chiefly engaged in getting in one another's way and quarrelling. But I suppose the work of the house could not have been carried on without them, though their number was distinctly inconvenient. In Rangoon, where the servants abound, it would be easy to dismiss and engage a dozen a day, but not so in the remoter stations. The natives of India will not leave the plains unless a strong inducement be offered, and the Burmese much prefer not to work if they can live without doing so. Burmans are usually excellent servants, but they are slow to learn and speak English, and the young housekeeper, who has probably been accustomed to English, or at least Hindustani-speaking servants in Rangoon, experiences great difficulty in making herself understood. All of our servants, with the exception of the cook, were Burmese, and when my brother happened to be away, and the cook was not at hand to interpret, we felt particularly helpless. And many a struggle have I to understand Po Sin's wants, or to make him understand mine. Housekeeping under such disadvantages is not a happy undertaking. Another way of passing time in which we indulged was cooking. It was cooking under difficulties. For the most important part, the baking, had perforce to be entrusted to the tender mercies of the cook, no one else being capable of understanding his intricate oven. And the cook, jealous of our trespass upon his prerogative, almost invariably served up our cakes in the guise either of soft dough or of black cinders. The chief objects of our cooking experiments were cakes and savouries. We neither of us knew very much about cooking, but we had cookery books and did what we could, supplying the place of the innumerable ingredients we did not possess with any we happened to have on hand. The result was usually distasteful. I made cakes with exceeding great vigour and confidence during almost the whole of my stay, but nobody ate them save myself from bravado, the dogs from greed, and the unsuspecting strangers from innocence. Cake making was a fashionable subject of conversation at the ladies' 5 o'clocks in Remyo, and everyone gave everyone else recipes. I was astonished to hear my sister, whom I knew to be almost entirely ignorant upon such subjects, glibly confiding recipes for all sorts of things on one of these occasions. I taxed her with the matter later, but she explained that it was the fashion to give recipes, and so long as she was careful to include an ingredient or two impossible to obtain, she could safely trust that no one would find her out. There is one shop in Remyo in addition to the native bazaar, and the ladies usually pay it a daily visit in order, I suppose, to add realism to their pretense of housekeeping. The method adopted on these occasions is remarkable. No one expects to find anything she really wants in the shop, as it is kept by a native of India, but she begins hopefully, asking for various articles, each demand being greeted by a shake of the head, but then asks the shopkeeper what he does happen to sell, at which he appears doubtful, but suggests some useless things such as antimacassars. The purchaser at length makes a tour of the shop, picks out the least useless article she can find, and bears it home in triumph. The unwise thing to do is to order an article from Rangoon or Mandalay. One is indeed lucky if it arrives within 12 months after being ordered, and without an expenditure of all one's powers of sarcasm and letters of remonstrance, and a fortune in stamps. Firstly, there will be received about a dozen letters, with intervals of 4 days or so between each, demanding fresh descriptions and explanations of the desired article. Then, when more specific description is an impossibility, letters for money will arrive, a request for a rupee for a carriage, another request for 5 annas for something else, for half a rupee that has been overlooked in the first account, and so on for 4 weeks more. Then the article is announced to be upon the way, but it does not arrive. More letters bring to light the fact that it is lost, has most mysteriously disappeared, cannot be traced anywhere. New people come upon the scene, letters from carriers and agents arrive, weeks elapse, still the article cannot be found. Another is in course of construction, when it is suddenly discovered that by some strange oversight the original was overlooked, never sent off at all, and is still reposing in the same tiresome shop. At length the once desired purchase arrives, but the purchaser has now long ceased to feel any interest in it whatever. The inhabitants of Remyo live together in apparent peace and friendliness, but there is between them one never-ending source of rivalry, their gardens. Gardening is one of the most fashionable employments in Remyo. Everyone has a garden, though the uninitiated would probably not recognize the fact, and the amount of time, thought, and energy expended thereon is worthy of better results than those I beheld. For the Remyoans are an ambitious folk, and are not content with the flowers, plants, and natural products of the country. Their desire is to have a real English garden, and with this end in view they sow innumerable seeds, set many bulbs, rake, dig, and water, or superintend these operations, till life is a burden both to themselves and to their servants. Possibly I did not remain long enough, but the results I saw were not satisfactory. It required a great stretch of imagination to mark any resemblance between a large bare compound covered with coarse jungle grass, dotted about with flat, grey-soiled beds containing a few withered-looking plants, half a dozen violets perhaps, and a haggard sunflower, and an English garden. Perhaps long absence from home had dulled their recollection of gardens in England. We were specially unlucky in our garden. Had we been content to confine our efforts to plants in pots and boxes, as did some of our wiser neighbours, we might have been fairly successful. But visions of rose gardens, artistically laid out beds, and mossy, violet-covered dells dazzled us, and our ambitions in this direction were boundless. The coarse grass, the poor soil, and the persistent reappearances of unsightly jungle weeds in all sorts of unexpected places should have daunted us, but we had souls above such trifles. Directly we had formed our plans, we set to work, scorning the advice of more experienced people, and disregarding all considerations of prepared beds, manure, and seasons. We marked out several intricately shaped beds, dug them up, lightly scattered some good soil over the top, and proceeded to sow our seed with hearty goodwill. The first difficulty we met was with regard to arrangement. Each of us had a favourite plan, the abandonment of which no arguments on the part of the others could persuade. At length, after much useless discussion, we decided each to go our own way, sow our seed where we chose, and leave it to nature to settle the difficulty. This was so far satisfactory, though we felt anxious when we found that nasturtiums had been sown on the top of daffodil bulbs, and one poor little bed of pansies had a border of sweet peas and sunflowers. For some days after we had laid out the garden, my sister and I had a wearing time. The first thing in the early mornings we hurried out for an eager search after signs of life in our seeds. We divided the day into watches, that someone might always be at hand to defend the precious seed from the marauding crows and pigeons. The cool of the evening, usually given up to tennis and other amusements, was devoted wholly to the fatiguing task of watering. At last, sooner in fact than we really expected, we were rewarded by a few delicate green shoots, peering cautiously above the ground. How tenderly we cherished those first fruits of our toil! How carefully we shaded them from the sun, watered them, and protected them from the evil onslaught of the pigeons! How angry we were when we discovered they were weeds! However, we were rewarded at last by the unmistakable appearance of cultivated plants. Nearly every seed sent up its little green shoot, and for a few days we were most pleasantly proud, and treated our friends with contemptuous pity, while we visited and measured the plants almost every half hour to see if they had grown in the interval. But our joy was short-lived, for from some cause or another, either the strong sun, the lack of water, or the poor soil, all our plants withered before they put forth flowers. At first we refused to believe our ill fortune. We told one another that it was always thus at first with delicate plants, that they must have more water and less sun. We covered them over in the heat of the day with waste paper baskets, topies, and cunningly erected tents of straw, and we risked our lives 100 times by running out in the hot sun to replace these, when the wind blew them away. We talked bravely of being able soon to gather bunches of daffodils, and to send our neighbours baskets of sweet peas. But we each felt all the time in our heart of hearts that our hopes were doomed to disappointment. At last we could keep up the delusion no longer, and owned the fact of our failure to one another, and being now sadder and wiser folk, threw away the withered plants and made a new garden, following this time the advice of our neighbours. The only plants which did prosper in this first garden were the nasturtiums. I verily believe they will flourish anywhere. And for several hours a tiny bed round the foot of a tree at the bottom of the compound veritably blazed with the colour afforded by 4 flourishing nasturtiums. But while we were at the club that evening, the crows pecked off all the petals of the flowers, and our only success was but a short-lived one. The kitchen garden, which we consigned to the care of Po Sin, our head boy, was rather more successful, our radishes and mustard and cress being the wonder of the countryside. Then we had good hopes for the peas too. There was one row about 10 inches high which looked really promising, and as we sat on the verandah in the evenings contemplating this cheerful sight, we talked longingly of the time when we should have a dish of our own peas for dinner. But alas for the vanity of human expectations! One morning my sister had sallied forth to inspect the garden, when I was startled by the despairing cry of "Come, come at once, the peas are flowering," and upon hurrying to the spot I found it too true. Our precious peas were already in flower, and nothing could be done to discourage them. After a few days the petals fell away, and the miniature pea pods, containing microscopic peas, appeared in their place. Our wishes were fulfilled. We had a dish, a very small one, of our own peas for dinner, but alas, it consisted of the produce of the entire row. Another source of much interest was our strawberry plant. I took 100 strawberry runners out with me from England, but unfortunately only one survived, which put forth 3 new shoots, and appeared for a time quite healthy, but never bore fruit. Still it may yet do so, and in the meantime it is much admired by all the inhabitants of Remyo. Our second garden, happily, being prepared with more regard to the demands of the climate, was a success, and wiped out the stain of our first failure. It is well that Remyo ladies can interest themselves in the manner I have indicated, for between breakfast and tea time the sun is so terribly hot as to render outdoor exercise quite impossible, and in the absence of many books, time is sometimes difficult to kill. Ladies in England, with their 101 occupations, their amusements, household duties, and perhaps charities to attend to, can have but a very faint conception of how wearisomely long and lonely are some days to their Anglo-Indian sisters. Their husbands away or busy much of the day, deprived of their children's society, with few books, few amusements, and practically no duties, life is far from being an unqualified joy to these exiled women. Let the British matron who would accuse her Eastern sister of idleness, frivolity, and worse, consider these things, and forbear to judge. The men, with their work and sport to engage their time, are less apt to find the days long, but even they at times feel the same strain. Indeed, I remember one day, when there was no work to be done, my brother and sister, who had but lately left Rangoon with its constant whirl of gaiety, became so hopelessly and desperately bored that we were reduced to revive our drooping spirits by making sugar toffee over the spirit kettle. Before breakfast and after tea are the opportunities for exercise and amusement, and the most is made of these cooler hours. Remyo boasts a gravelled tennis court and a 9-hole golf course, mostly bunkers. 2 more tennis courts and a cricket and polo ground are in course of construction, preparatory to the arrival of the great future to which I have referred. Each form of exercise enjoys about 3 days' popularity at a time. At one time tennis will be the rage, and everyone repairs to the club court, though so short are the evenings before sunset that it is impossible to play more than 3 sets an afternoon, so we are forced to be content with about 3 games each. Then the tennis rage dies away, and golf suddenly becomes the fashionable game. Like most occupations in Remyo, golf is golf under difficulties, though personally, whenever and wherever I play golf, I play under difficulties. The links are chiefly jungle, and a wood axe would probably be the most useful accessory to the enjoyment of the game. The holes are short, and a good player would probably drive onto the green every time. But at Remyo we were not good players. If by some lucky chance one drove perfectly straight, there was nothing worse to fear than a tree, or a deep nullah filled with reeds and hoof marks. A nullah where might be spent a harassing quarter of an hour slashing at a half-hidden ball, which, in sheer desperation, one was at least compelled to pick out. But if the drive were not straight, then what endless and interesting possibilities or impossibilities were revealed. Heaps of stones, impenetrable bushes, reeds, rabbit holes, and every form of acute misery which the golfer's soul can conceive. Yet the links are very popular, and are the scene of many an exciting match, in spite of lost balls, broken clubs, and lost tempers. I have seen 3 clubs broken by one man in an afternoon's match, and he was neither a particularly bad player nor especially violent. The Burman is not a success as a caddie. Our Lugalays looked upon the game at first with indifference, then with dislike. I think they imagined that we purposely drove the ball into a hopeless tangle of grass and bushes in order to scold them when they could not find it. They could never be induced to make any distinction between the clubs, and looked hurt when we curtly refused to drive with our putters. Their notion of marking balls, too, is very primitive. Po Mya only found one during my stay, which it turned out was an old one lost some days before. In fine, they seem to think it the greatest folly that we should tramp up and down and in and out of nullahs, and lose our temper so unnecessarily because of a small white ball, when we had plenty more at home. On some afternoons everyone will repair to the new polo and cricket ground, and walk up and down the new laid turf, discussing solemnly the drainage and general advantages and disadvantages of the field. Or, feeling energetic, will practice cricket, and the knowing ones will give exhibitions of tricky polo strokes. The making of the polo ground was seriously delayed at first on account of the divergent opinions as to the best site, each declaring his selection to be the only one possible, and showering unlimited contempt upon all others. Each day we were dragged off to inspect a new spot, and all appeared to me so equally lacking in points of advantage that I had no difficulty in impressing each new discoverer with my knowledge in such matters, by disparaging in confidence all other schemes than his. Finally a site was chosen, and while the ground was in course of construction, those whose views had been disregarded derived the satisfaction, always to be had in such cases, of discussing the insurmountable obstacles to the selected proposal. Some afternoons were devoted to rides. The jungle around Remyo is lovely, though not being there during the rains I did not see it to perfection. There are delightful rides in every direction, and exquisite views from the hills, whence can be seen for miles nothing but undulating waves of jungle, every colour from deepest reds and browns to the bright pink of the peach blossom and the pale green of the feathery bamboos. It is a wonderful sight, this unbroken jungle, bordered in the far distance by the shadowy blue hills of the Shan States. Sometimes we visited giant pagodas, with their neighbouring pretty many-roofed kangs, where the yellow-robed Punjis wander in meditation, or study neath the shade of the palm and banana groves. The pagodas are all very similar in shape, and near to each is a tazung full of images of Gautama, with ever the same calm, peaceful smile, denoting a philosophy superior to the cares and artificialities of the world around. Sometimes we rode along narrow jungle paths, bordered by a tangled mass of bright-coloured bushes and undergrowth, or by the tall waving jungle grass which is always whispering. These paths lead to tiny collections of bamboo huts, surrounded by high fences to keep out dacoits and other marauders, where the unambitious native leads a peaceful, contented life under the shadow of the bamboos and peepul trees, an uneventful existence, enlivened perhaps occasionally by a pwé or visit to a pagoda feast at a neighbouring village. I enjoyed these expeditions, though they were ever fraught with danger to my limbs. Nothing would induce me again to mount a pony. I had had sufficient experience, so I accompanied the others on my bicycle. Of late years many wonderful bicycle riders have exhibited their tricks to the public, but I am certain none have performed such extraordinary feats as are called for by the state of the Burmese roads. Most of them are mere jungle tracks, ploughed in every direction into deep ruts by the bullock carts. It was impossible to ride in the furrows, as they were not sufficiently wide to allow the pedals to work round, so I was obliged to perform a sort of plank riding trick along the top of the rut. Occasionally my eminence would break off abruptly, and unless the bicycle succeeded in jumping the gap, a fall was inevitable. Never had bicycle such severe usage, nor ever did such yeoman service as mine, but, save an occasional twist of the handlebars or a bent spoke, I never met with a serious accident, and I soon learned the art of falling softly. My anxieties too were increased by the mistaken kindness of my companions, who would persist in riding beside me and conversing. One man in particular, I have forgiven him, for I know he meant it kindly, would never consent to leave me to ride alone. He would trot along on his pony, either just beside or, worse still, just behind me, when I felt I might fall at any moment, and that he could not help riding over me. He would chatter away gaily, while I, with agonized expression, struggled along, one eye on the road and one eye on the pony, scarce heeding his remarks, making the most hopelessly vague replies to his questions, and committing myself to I know not what opinions. One day we actually took a walk. We ladies grew weary of our customary amusements, and though we had none of us done much walking since we left England, we hailed the new idea with delight. The men refused to accompany us. The English civilian in the East seems to forget how to walk, so we went with only a servant or two to carry our cameras, refreshments, and other necessities. We walked about 5 miles through the jungle to a little native village surrounded entirely by clumps of feathery bamboos, a most exquisite spot. We climbed a neighbouring hill where stood the inevitable pagoda and kang, and were rewarded by a perfect view. Our photographic intentions were unfulfilled, for as we were about to focus our cameras, a jungle fire was set alight below, and the smoke, drifting across the valley towards us, most effectively obscured our view. We were forced to be content with photographing one another, the most beautiful substitutes we could find. We examined the pagoda, peeped into the kang, and tried to induce the Punji to come out and be photographed, but the pious man, evidently a hermit, shut himself promptly into the inner recesses of his dwelling, and continued to read in a loud voice until we had taken our departure. We thought him unnecessarily suspicious, and should have been hurt had we not felt it to be really rather a compliment to our charms. Our expedition was on the whole a success, but as we arrived home very hot and tired, having lost our way once or twice, we failed to convince the stay-at-home guests that we had enjoyed ourselves without them. One morning early, my sister and I were startled by a succession of shots, which rang out close to the house. My brother was away in the district, making an official tour of the villages under his charge, so we were alone and unprotected. Hurrying to the window, what was our astonishment to see a band of Gurkhas, under command of one of the subalterns of the detachment stationed at Remyo, defending our house against an unseen enemy who lurked in the neighbouring jungle and kept up an incessant firing. My mind first flew to dacoits, then to French or Chinese. I knew there had been trouble on the border. Then, on catching the sight of one of the enemy, and recognising him also as a Gurkha, I knew mutiny must have broken out. Trouble of this kind always breaks out unexpectedly, I have heard. Soon, however, we were forced to suppose that it must be a revolution, for leading the enemy on to attack was the second of the two subalterns of the detachment. It was difficult to believe that this usually shy and retiring young man could be the leader of a disloyal rising, but there he was, excitedly encouraging his followers to attack the house. We hastily prepared lint and bandages for the wounded, and watched with beating hearts the progress of the fight. Suddenly both sides ceased firing. The leaders advanced towards one another, conversed amicably together, evidently settled their differences, summoned their troops, and marched them home to breakfast. It was a sham fight. This appears to be the favourite amusement of the officers who form the military element of Remyo society. I was continually finding myself in the midst of desperate encounters when taking my rides abroad. It was rather disconcerting at first, but I grew accustomed to it in time, as one grows accustomed to anything, and would ride along the line of fire with a coolness and indifference worthy of one of the old seasoned campaigners. I suppose to those who live in a military district, sham fights are ordinary affairs, but I had never seen one before, and it struck me as very ludicrous to see these men, in most desperate earnestness, crouching in ambush, dodging behind trees, and crawling along under cover to escape the fire of their foes. The little Gurkhas become wildly excited, and it would not do to allow the two sides to come to close quarters, or the sham fight might develop into a real one. The other European male inhabitants of Remyo are the inevitable Indian civilian and Bombay Burman, whom of course I should not presume to analyse. The two railwaymen, who seem superfluous as there is yet no railway, a P.W.D. (Public Works Department) man, whose work it seems is to make roads. From my point of view as a cyclist they don't do him credit, an engineer, and the policeman. This last was a mighty shikari, who had hunted and shot every imaginable animal, who knew the habits and customs of all the beasts of the jungle, and after examining a kill, would give a whole history of the fight between the tiger and its victim. He was a mighty talker too, and would converse for hours on any subject. What he could not accomplish was to speak for 3 minutes without giving way to exaggeration, nor could he give an unvarnished reply to a plain question, so that in Remyo, if you want to know the time, don't ask a policeman, is the popular aphorism. The engineer possessed the most striking characteristics amongst the men of the place. I have never met a man so full of information. He was one of those men who can give information on every conceivable subject, for if he knows nothing about it, he will invent a few facts on the spur of the moment, facts of which he is always justly proud. I never quite made up my mind whether his actions were the outcome of a passion for practical joking or a desire to be of use, but I truly believe the latter. When I punctured my bicycle tire, he insisted upon helping me to mend it. His process occupied the whole of an afternoon, and the front veranda and drawing room. Beyond this it was too intricate to describe, except to say that it required all the available toothbrushes in the house, 3 basins of water, and a rupee piece, and necessitated apparently the cutting of a large hole in the inner tube with a patent tire remover he had invented out of a broken teaspoon. On another occasion he assured us he had a splendid plan for preventing our drawing room stove from smoking. We had been obliged to put a stove in the drawing room to make up for the absence of a fireplace. It was a primitive affair, with a chimney that went through a hole in the wall, and it smoked something awful. Our friend tried his plan and a dozen others, each more wonderful and complicated than the last, and each necessitating fresh holes in the already perforated wall. Each plan, too, resulted in increased volumes of smoke. And as the furniture and carpet were being rapidly ruined, and our whilom happy home was being broken up, we finally remedied the matter ourselves. But the matter wherein our engineer excelled himself was the matter of rose trees. Hearing us one day express a wish for a rose garden, he declared at once that nothing was easier. He was departing for Rangoon in 2 days, and he would procure and send to us rose cuttings, which we must plant in carefully prepared boxes of soil, following the instructions which he would give us concerning their welfare, and we should soon have flourishing rose trees. Our gratitude was unbounded. We listened and carefully noted his instructions, and after his departure eagerly awaited the fulfilment of his promise. In a few days a coolie delivered to our house what I took at first to be twigs for firewood, but on examining the letter accompanying them, I discovered they were the promised rose cuttings. I felt some doubts about them, but my sister had implicit faith in the engineer. The stove incident came later, and would not listen to me. So we planted the rose cuttings, and for 6 whole weeks we did tend them. All the instructions we carried out to the letter, watering twice daily, and sheltering them from the sun by day, and from the cold dews by night, but all to no avail. Dead sticks they were, and dead sticks they remained, till at last, convinced of the hopelessness of attempting to restore life to the withered things, we tore them up in desperation and burnt them. My sister's faith in the engineer, however, remained still unshaken, and she protested that the coolie must have lost the original bunch of rose cuttings, and substituted those twigs in their place. For my part, I believe no such thing, and when I consider what passionate care and tenderness we lavished on those unresponsible pieces of wood, I do indeed feel disposed to speak with many words. Varied though the characters and interests of the Remyo inhabitants may be, in one particular they all agree, in their dislike of the casual visitor. The casual visitor is supposed to ruin the servants, to monopolize the tennis courts and golf links, to abuse the privileges of honorary membership of the club, to unjustly criticize the polo ground, and generally to destroy the peace and harmony of the station. For the men, the advent of a lady visitor means calls, dinner parties, and the necessity of wearing best clothes, which fills them with horror. For the ladies, it means the advent of one who will possess the latest fashions from Rangoon, possibly from England, who will throw into the shade their gala costumes of the fashion of 2 years ago, who will trespass upon their prerogatives, rival their powers at tennis and golf, and generally interfere with their peaceful and innocent pursuits. The arrival of visitors, therefore, is not welcomed as a rule, and though hospitably received and comfortably housed, they are not admitted to the inner life of the station until they have shown themselves quite innocent of the evil qualities which are impugned to them. This unexpected unfriendliness on the part of the Remyoans has been brought about by the acts of 2 people who once visited this happy valley and departed again, leaving deeply rooted indignation behind them. Of the first, a woman, it suffices to say that she amply justified the suspicions of the Remyo ladies. Her name is never mentioned by them without a significant look, and she is not a safe subject for discussion. The crime of the second sinner against Remyo hospitality, a man, was of a different nature, and it is perhaps difficult for the female mind to grasp the enormity of the offence. A large tiger had made its appearance in the neighbourhood, and a tiger shoot had been organised. All the arrangements were complete. The men were sure of success, and speculated which of their number would have the luck to kill. The evening before the shoot, a visitor on his way from a remote station arrived in Remyo, and obtained permission to accompany the sportsman. As he was reputed to be a very bad shot, this was readily given, and there was allotted to him a position well out of the expected line of the beat. The tiger broke near the stranger's tree, and he killed it with his first shot, the promoters of the shoot never even getting a sight of the game. The criminal impertinence of a mere stranger daring to kill their tiger roused the deepest feelings of indignation among the Remyoans. The laws of hospitality are above all, so the perpetrator of the crime was allowed to escape with his life and the tiger skin, but since that day strangers have been looked upon as suspicious interlopers, and prospective tiger shoots are not discussed in presence of the casual visitor. I have given my impressions of the Remyo society candidly, perhaps a little too candidly, but lest any who read this book be disposed to hold the latter opinion, let me say one thing more. The first, the last, and the most indelible impression left on my mind by all the Anglo-Burmans whom I had the pleasure of meeting, was the impression of a kindness, friendliness, and hospitality passing belief. The Anglo-Burmans, while retaining the best qualities of the English nation, seem to lose entirely that cold and suspicious reserve towards strangers, of which we are often so justly accused. They appear to have adopted those Eastern laws of hospitality, which lay so great a stress on the duty of entertaining strangers, and they cannot do enough to welcome those fellow countrymen who visit the land of their exile. This characteristic kindness of the Anglo-Burmans is so universally acknowledged that it is really superfluous to mention it. But as I spent 6 months among them, without encountering a single unkind look, word, or deed, I cannot let the opportunity pass without offering my tribute of gratitude to this most kind-hearted and generous people. End of chapter 6.